All right. Thanks to everybody for being here today. I've got a friend of mine that is a black tech founder. He's very versed in tech and startups and working in different technology organizations. And so this is Kolapo. And so, Kolapo, if you could just tell us a little bit about kind of like your history, your background, some of the startups that you were a part of earlier on in your career, and kind of where you're at now and what you're doing. And then we'll take some questions from some folks, and I'll throw some questions into you as well. So
Okay, awesome.
let me go ahead and mic you up. There you go.
All right, awesome. My name is Kolapo Akande. I am the founder of Pledge Software. My background is in software engineering. I used to be a career consultant, so I have about 20 years of experience in the tech field. I've been the founder of a couple startups. I've also used to be a small business owner, so I used to own a restaurant. And what's it called? That's I'll say the long and short of me. Um, I uh, I have a couple patents in the software space, in rideshare. Um, I think that's really it. I have uh, two kids. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to know about me, but that's the long and short of me. Um, and I'm open to answering any questions that you might have.
How long have you been the owner of your current company?
So my current company, I want to say like a year and change. So it's an early stage startup. It's a startup in the nonprofit space that connects nonprofits with donors and resources. It's called pactman.org. So we're still building it out, but that's it.
Tell the folks about your first startup, the first startup you were a part of.
Huh. Well, that's an interesting one. All right. So the first startup that I worked with, or my own startup?
I think that you work with, because there was a guy that you told me about a guy that you're working with that he was like, y'all got to move to Cali.
Ah, okay. Well, yeah. Okay. So at the time I was working in Accenture. So I used to be a manager in Accenture in like 2013, thereabout. Um, and I was doing it part-time initially. So I had a co-founder at the time. He's gone on to do big things, exited 9 figures. I'm not going to say the name of the company, but, black tech co-founder too. And we had, a measure of success, but it didn't quite pan out, at least us together, because we had differences of vision. Yes, exactly. You know, um, I would say that um, where we kind of differed in vision was where, I was a young married father with a son, and he was, very aggressive and wanted us to move to California, and we didn't, in my opinion, have the kind of traction that we needed, at the time, and he moved to California, and that's where things just kind of, uh, you know, that's where we kind of, I'd say went our separate ways. But, since then, I've, owned my own startup where I was a solo founder, where, built applications. So, with a startup called Coleman, that was the startup where, we built an application that did scheduled ride shares. So this was before Uber had ride shares, and that's where I have 3 patents in software. So had a measure of success with that. The patents are actually licensed, um, um, and gone on to do other things. I've owned like I mentioned before, owned a restaurant. That was interesting. I will never do that again. you know. And right now I'm working on, my current startup, and, hoping we can take it to plenty zeros, you know.
Oh, what?
Plenty zeros, you know.
Do you still own the other startups, or you're just focusing on
Oh no, I'm just focusing on this. It's hard to really focus on too many things at the same time. Um, especially when it's still very early stage, it's hard to do that. I mean, I think at the point where you have stability and you have growth, then it's a little easier to diversify, so to speak. When I started initially with, my co-founder then, when I was in Accenture, what I would do was essentially work, and Accenture, I mean, at least the group I was in Accenture was pretty grueling. So I'd work, morning all through maybe till like 6, then get home, then maybe like, I don't know, maybe 9 p.m. to like 3 a.m., so it was a lot of work, doing it part-time. But, there's no one way to success. I've interacted with many different founders, and their path to success has varied, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So let's talk about the actual development process.
Okay.
Right? And so most of the people here are Scrum Masters, project managers, program managers, delivery leads of some sort. And so when it comes to, and if you want to talk about a previous org that you worked in or your current organization, what is the role, or what do you see the role of we'll call them a Scrum Master for a development team?
All right. So my current startup is a small startup, so we wear multiple hats, right? I would say the kind of organizations where you probably need a Scrum Master are, larger organizations, where you have like a lot of moving pieces. What's the question again?
So
Yep.
how many developers do you have in your current org?
So
Engineers.
typically, 2 or 3.
Okay.
About 2 or 3 in various, what's it called? In various roles, essentially.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so how do you currently manage the work that those teams do? Like, is there a backlog of work that they go through, features that you've created for them, or what does that look like?
So, the earlier the company is in the startup process, the less there is a process.
Yeah.
So I'll say for a Scrum Master, for a project manager, if you go into a small organization, be ready to be flexible and just do whatever it takes to get the job done. Honestly, the way I look at tools, I look at Scrum, like the whole Scrum process as a tool. So if you want to call it Scrum, you want to call it Waterfall, whatever it is, it's a tool. And that's just your starting point. You have to figure out what parts of that tool essentially are relevant for the organization you go to. So for very large organizations, so I used to work at AT&T. I was a consultant there in 2005, and that was a very rigid organization, right? Their process was their process. They did not deviate. They followed everything, and they used Waterfall. They followed everything to a T, right? And when I compare that with startups, so I used to work at a subsidiary of Hunt Oil. So this Hunt Oil is somewhere here in Dallas, right? And they were more fluid. So they weren't as rigid with their processes. So you kind of have to get a feel for what kind of organization it is. The bigger the organization, the more rigid they're going to be, and the more all these gates you're going to follow it. And even then, the definition of whether you want to call it Scrum, Agile, Waterfall varies from organization to organization, right? You have the textbook definition, but an organization can decide that we don't want to do daily scrums. We want to do once a week. For my company, we don't have anything rigid. Like I tend to, what's it called? Evaluate the specific situation. There's some developers that I feel like need more babying, so maybe I need to meet with you every day. For some people, it's once a week. For me, my own ultimate criteria for success is just, are we moving the ball forward? So it really just depends, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So when it comes to, and if y'all have any questions, y'all feel free to jump in at any time. So when it comes to your area of expertise as it relates to like technology, like for example, the patents that you've created,
Yeah.
what, like, I don't know, programming language, what like breakthroughs did you make in software that made you feel like, or that enabled you to create those patents?
Oh, okay. So, taking a step back, right? Patent really is something unique and novel. So, if you have something that is truly unique and not, what's the word, or how you describe that? Not obvious, non-obvious. I think that's the word that the patent examiner called it. If you have something that's non-obvious, you could patent it. In terms of technologies, having a patent doesn't have anything specifically to do with doesn't have anything to do with technologies. I've worked with a range of technologies in the past. I mean, I've worked with, Python, C++, JavaScript, JS, so the type of technology doesn't really matter as much. It's just having something that's novel, a business solution that's novel, and that people, that's non-obvious in your industry. That's really the foundation of getting a patent, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. And so can you speak specifically about the patents that you have and what they enable, or what's novel about them?
So at the time that we, the patents were done, there was no, my company was creating an app called Coleman, which scheduled ride shares. So this was before Uber scheduled ride shares, right? And, from the outside looking in, some of the things might seem simple, but it's one of those kind of things that when you actually do, you see that, okay, there are a couple things that are not as obvious, and that's where the non-obvious part comes in, and that's where things that you can patent come into play.
Gotcha. So
Yeah.
Can you discuss your patent?
That would be putting me on the spot. It's been a couple years.
Okay, nah, it's cool. It's cool. So tell me about, so when you create the technical infrastructure
Yeah.
for the product that you're working on right now, can you walk us through what platform it's built on? And
Like what we're working on right now? Okay. All right. Oh, that's interesting.
you're doing like AWS, you're doing
Okay, yeah.
Azure, you're doing Google Cloud.
Yeah. So we currently are on Azure, right? It's Kubernetes, so it's a microservices architecture. It's Kubernetes, it's Kafka, it's Node.js, is Angular, Postgres SQL. What else? I feel like I'm missing something. But anyway, so it's a number of technologies that we're using, for the current application we're working on, and smaller, software tools that make everything work.
Gotcha. And so, how many different environments are your teams working in? Like, do you have, how many dev environments do you have? How many production
Oh, okay, I see what
environments?
you're
How many sandboxes?
So right now, we have three, I want to say rough three, and that's in quote. So typically a developer would have their own environment, their local environment, and we have two centralized environments. So a staging environment, or you could call it a test environment, and a production environment. That's what I have. But you could be in an organization that has way more environments. There's no right or wrong answer. I know in general, from my experience, you want to have at least one environment outside of the production environment where you could make changes to, validate that everything works the way it's supposed to, from a test perspective, before migrating changes to, production. That's the one thing I'd say. Yeah. Yeah, please.
So how do you make sure that your sandbox and dev environment has enough data to mimic production? That's not that that's an ongoing issue in the roles I've been in.
So like what is enough data? Essentially.
I'm not a technical guy, but I hear the developers always talk about
stale.
full sample data
Okay.
or enough production data in the sandbox environment to truly mimic what production would
So
look like.
it's what is enough data is usually very subjective, right? Because the perfect situation is that your alternate environments are exactly like production. Because the whole idea of having secondary environments is to provide a safe enough space to run your tests, whatever it is, before you push code to production, right? Because if you went straight from like a developer's laptop to production, what would happen is, one, there'll be a lot of bugs. You probably piss off your customers. And just you have all kinds of issues, right? So the perfect situation really is that your centralized environments have as much data as in production. But more often than not, that tends to not be possible for a number of reasons. It could be cost. So for example, like our production environment has 2.6 million nonprofits, right? There's a cost to hosting that. If you had to replicate your production, like say your production environment cost, I don't know, $50,000 a month, right? And you decided to make a duplicate environment in test, right? Now, at the end of the day, it's a business, right? Now your running cost is $100,000, right? So more often than not, in my experience, what I've found is that what dictates the amount of data or the quality of data you have in a secondary environment really is, what's it called? The test cases or test scenarios you need to run. So for example now, right, in our case, we have 2.6 million nonprofits in production environment. Most of the nonprofits, are fairly similar. When I say fairly similar, not in terms of their names, their missions, their such and such, right? In terms of just their structure, right? Do you really need 2.6 million nonprofits to validate that a nonprofit's display properly? No. You might, maybe 100,000 might be enough. And there's a very big difference between 100,000 and say, 2.6 million. That's a factor of 30. So it might be something like that. There's usually a fine line where you could make it similar enough where you get the test that you want done. So like for example now in our staging environment, right, we use Docker instead of Kubernetes just because it's easier for deployment. Yeah, So it's not a one-to-one match with production, but it's close enough that we could validate all our functionality before we push features out to production. So hopefully I answered your question. Any other questions?
Yeah, so let me move the camera and we're going to move up just a little bit. So I brought this. So I want to talk through the environment. So if you
Okay.
all right. All right, so I've diagrammed this out at least as best as I believe I could. What's that? I don't think so. I think we're good here. Is this better? All right, cool. So we've got our environments here. So you said that you've got your developers working out of a local dev environment.
Yeah, so
right?
Each developer would have
Their own-
their own environment. So it's actually multiple. So if you have 10 developers, you're going to have 10 local environments essentially.
And so all of these are going to be copies of one another, essentially, right? So we'll just say local dev 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so each of these is assigned to a single developer or development team member, right? And so this local environment is the lowest environment. So the developers can make changes here, and it's not going to affect anything in any of the higher environments, as we call it, or it's not going to break anything in production. So I can do any testing that I want to do in my local environment. Does that make sense? All right, so after I've made my tests and done my development and say, okay, everything that I've created is good, there are no bugs, and now we can escalate it to the next environment, so we'll put it in the staged environment. And so can you explain what staged is, or
Staging environment. Okay. So typically, your local environment is what you call your bleeding environment, where everything is bleeding edge in terms of versions of software, right? So if you have, so essentially it's the same software across different environments. Typically production is the one that doesn't change as much. So I put version 2, version 3, version 4 just, to make it easier to understand. The developers are fixing all kinds of bugs, making mistakes, all kinds of things. They might do a build every day. So with my startup then in Komen, we did 2 production builds. I would say on average, at least one. Some weeks, 2 a week. Sometimes one a week. But it was a pretty fast-paced deployment process. But even though 2 a week, for example, might sound like a lot, in the local environment, he might have been doing 5 a day. And he's not, typically developers don't do a lot of tests. So they're just pushing stuff out there, doing very light tests to see, okay, does it even look right? So if you think about like a website, for example, now, right? He might just pull it up on Chrome and see, does it look good, right? And, from there, he decides to push it to staging. Depending on what staging is, right? It could be an environment where your QA people look at, so they will now look at it, they'll test it on Chrome, they'll test it on mobile devices, they'll test it on, if you still use IE or Edge or whatever the case may be. So they do more thorough tests, right? With their test cases, test plans, and everything like that. And they find issues, then they shoot it back to development, right? And development fixes whatever issues there are, then it comes back here. So you could have like a cycle essentially of local dev to staging, right? Till, the folks at this stage, typically QA, say, hey, you know what, the software looks good. We're okay with version 3, even though they're on version 5. We're okay with version 3. I think you can push it to production. So push it to production, then that's where your customers tell you whether it's good or not. And like I said, this is just one example of startup environment, right? But you could have, I've been in organizations where you have a UAT environment. So UAT could be something that your customers get an early look on. It's not production itself, but it's an environment that's for certain customers. Yeah. So it could go from like staging or test to UAT. And I've also been in organizations where staging is shared with UAT, or even staging is shared with development. So development actually shares the environment. And I've been in an environment, startups where, you have environment for performance testing, just for performance testing, which is separate from staging or UAT or whatever. So there's no one way, right? The biggest thing is setting up a structure that, helps you manage risk. Because this is really all this is just managing risk, right? Because if you had a situation where, and I've seen this before, I haven't personally managed an organization that has done this, but I've seen it where some developers work directly in production. Yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And that's where you see crazy things happen, because it's not advisable. Now, there's sometimes where there's certain issues that cannot be reproduced. So, say for example, a customer says, "Hey, my maybe it's a bank application, right? My account's not loading, or maybe my account balance is saying $0 and I have $100,000 in there, right?" And they raise it up like it's a big deal. Somebody's making a fuss, and they capture the details of that person's account. Okay, maybe what type of browser they're using, anything that's unique about it, and they say, okay, let's try to recreate it here in staging, and they can't recreate it. They try to recreate in local development, they can't do it for whatever reason. Sometimes that happens, and it has to be fixed in production. So that happens too. For what, but I found that most times that's not the case. Usually, when issues can't be, at least in my experience, when issues can't be reproduced in other environments, it's has to do with maybe the load. So the amount of customers. So, because staging maybe has 2 people on it at most, right? This environment has 10,000 people on it at one time. That's usually what I've found is a difference. Or the environments are not exactly the same, which is often the case too.
Yeah.
So
let's talk about that, right? So I've worked in organizations where we have more environments than this, but because we want our developers working on the closest thing to production in stage, right? We want that, like Brandon was saying, the data to be similar. Production backs up to stage maybe every 24 hours. And then stage backs up to maybe the local environment every once a week, we'll say, right? What is your backup policy, or do you guys have a policy?
So I know some organizations do that. In our case, we try not to do that because, say for example, you're working in health industry. You have HIPAA laws, right? If you do that, then you now have somebody has cancer. Now you know about it, right? You're probably violating some kind of some kind of law, right? So it really just depends, right? For us, what we do is we have local backups of production itself. So the databases, get backed up separately. So there's a backup of the customer data somewhere, So maybe this is the backup, and this is the original, right? So we do that in staging. I believe we do that also in staging, but it's not as important. The actual, code for the application, that's stored, and I mean there are different ways of doing it, but we use Git, right? So all our code is on there, if that makes sense, So like a lot of these things, and I'm sorry I always say it depends, because it really does depend.
Yeah.
So I think for me, as a software engineer and as a startup founder, what I've just found is that, you don't want to be too dogmatic about rules. You want to start with what are you trying to solve? What type of risk are you trying to mitigate, right? And based off of that, determine what's the best course of action. And with more experience, you're able to make those kind of determinations, right? So in our case, for example, now the fact that we have local environments for the developers, one staging and one production. The reason why we have that is because cost, and also there's not just the actual physical cost of running these environments. There's also the management of the environments, because the more environments you have, now somebody has to manage them. There's Azure comes out with something that says, a particular module needs to be updated. It's going to take a day to update it. Now, you have to do it here, 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 and if you have more environments, you have to do it everywhere.
Right.
Somebody has to do it.
Somebody's gonna do it.
So there's that.
If there's a security issue,
Yep.
right, you got to patch it on all
All
the
across,
systems, right? If there's, if one of the systems gets infected, right, with a virus or something like that, you have to, either uninstall, reinstall, debug, whatever, right? So for sure, there's definitely a cost with all of these, and even, in the organization I'm working with right now, like when it comes to cost, a lot of times what will happen is like this developer will get laid off. And this environment that they're working in is costing the company, I don't know, we'll say $10K a month. But we don't disable this. Even after he gets let go, we're still being billed month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4, month 5, month 6. It's not until 12 months later that somebody's like, oh, why are we still getting billed for that? That's $120,000 down the drain that we can't get back. Because Azure or Google or AWS, whoever, is going to charge us every month for that, because we're using space in their cloud, right? So now there's a whole nother role that's responsible for managing these licenses, right? And so, the company I work for right now, I think we did an analysis. I was part of a group that did an analysis, and something like, I don't know, $2.5 million that we found in wasted cloud costs. Cloud costs that we just took a small part of the organization and we're like, let's audit them to see how much did us not paying attention to what was going on cost us. Like over $2 million just in this small area. So if we extrapolate that data across the entire org, we could be wasting over 100 million, 200 million dollars in stuff that we just forgot to turn off, right? And so part of that is like, okay, so let's restrict how many different environments or cloud services we're using so that we don't have to then go back at the end of the day and try to keep up with it. What's up?
This is kind of need for work, things clicking. So what would be some examples of some of those local or lower environments that would be used? 2 to 3 to 4 to 5.
So for example, so I'll put it into Scrum terms, right? So we've got a development team with 5 developers on it. So this is developer 1's environment that he's using, developer 2, 3, 4, and 5. So each of them have their own local copy of the lower environment. Well, guess what? He was talking about UAT over here. Well, guess what? We might have 2 UAT people on the team. So each of our UAT people might have their own UAT environment as well. So this is just so developer 4 can make the changes to the stories that he's working on or the features he's working on, and developer 3 is not also making some changes and it messes his stuff up. Because for every change that happens in the environment, it's going to potentially affect everything else in the environment in some way. And so this if we're all working in the same environment, if you got 1 person, 2, 3, 4, which some companies do, but if you've got everybody working in the same environment, we don't know who caused the issue. Was it person 1 or was it person 6? So when you isolate their changes to separate environments, this person can know it was working before I made my change, but after I made this change, this is what broke it, so I need to lean in there and see what's wrong with that code, right? And so we don't have to worry about, what is it called when you test all of the changes together?
Regression
Regression
testing.
right? So now when we put it all in staged, we do regression testing. So now we're testing, does developer 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5's changes work well together, right? They worked individually, but will they work well together here, right? And so those are some examples of some of the environments. But I mean, literally this production stage local environment could look totally
different, yeah.
depending on the organization that you're with. You mentioned Git.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Can you, if I flip this around to the other side, can you diagram kind of what Git does or enables developers to do when it comes to like branching code and making changes?
I could do something rough.
Okay, yeah, give us something rough.
All right. So Vic put me on the spot.
Yeah.
So, take anything I say with
A grain of salt.
a grain of salt. do your own research.
Google it and chat GPT it when he's finished.
Right. So you have, it's code. I believe it's code management software, right? Mm-hmm. Right. So Git, I believe right now it's the most popular.
Gotta be, yeah.
Say this is a code base right here. Version 1, right? And you have these developers here. Dev 1, actually, Dev 2, Dev 2, Dev 3. 3, all right? Come in, code, version 1.1, another branch, here, code, version 2, right? You could have 3 developers essentially working on, or multiple developers, right? Working on different versions of the code, right? I'm trying to see what's in layman's terms, what's probably the easiest way to think about this. All right, so imagine a scenario where you have multiple customers, but they have different versions of the same software. They're not all working or using the same software, but different versions because they have customizations, whatever it is, right? But you built like a version 1, right? Tools like Git allow you to, number one is track changes to software and also manage different versions of the software. That's what Git allows you to do. So you could have a developer working in this code branch. You could have another developer working in here, another developer working here, right? And you could also have multiple developers working in the same code branch, which allows you to merge code, see what changes specific developers have made, right? And also just manage your software in general, where you want to deploy. So, and there's no.
So is it in the environment that Git manages the code changes?
No. This is completely different. So environments is something completely different. Environments has I don't want to say nothing to do with it, but think of it as two different streams of thought.
Okay, but I'm saying you're saying it manages the changing of the different versions, right?
Yes.
Okay, at which stage of the process?
So if you go back to the original, what's it called? Original diagram here, right? That could be all one same version of code, right? Or, well, actually, no, I take that back. Because typically you have, I guess, yeah, let's do that.
Those are sandbox environments, right?
What do you mean?
The ones right up there now, red. They're not live environments.
No, one is live,
This is
prod,
live one, production.
production.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's live.
Okay, so I guess to your question, tying it together, right? Version 1 could be here, right? Version 2 could be in staging. And, the bleeding edge is always in the local development. Maybe version 3. Version 3 is here. But remember, like the local environment, right? You have developers have different instances of the same local environment. So they could be working on different versions, right? You could have one developer working on this, one developer working on this version right here, and such, right? So that's really what it is. And there's typically a way to pull code in each environment, from the Git repository, if that makes sense. I don't know, I hope I'm not throwing you guys for a loop.
I'm following.
You following? Okay, all right.
Some folks are a little bit more technical than others.
Yeah.
So this is probably going over some people's heads.
Please ask a question. I'll try to explain as much as I can.
It's still good because we all need to get more technical.
Yeah.
So you're giving us some of the language in the direction at least that we need to go back and do some research on. So this is good.
So please ask questions, if I made things a little more, jumbled it up for you.
No, you're good. I think you're good.
Because I never knew what Git actually.
Yeah, so it's probably the number one code management tool out there. Yeah.
And our org is about to get it, so it's making us things
Yeah.
are clicking.
Before it used to be Subversion. Subversion used to be the number one code management tool, but Git, is what most developers will use. Yeah. So, please ask. If there's anything I said that doesn't make sense, please ask. I'll try to explain as much as I can. No? Everybody got it? Okay. All right.
What do you think is the most difficult part about managing the software development process?
That's a very broad question. Honestly, it's people. It's just people. If you're a good manager of people, you would be able to, as a Scrum Master, I think generally you'll be fine. People is the hardest part. You have some developers that don't play well with, you have some developers, for example, that are A+++ rock stars. And from a technical perspective, yeah. And what I've found is developers, the best developers tend to not play nice with others. And they know that they have, high job mobility relative to everybody else.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, they might talk to you some kind of way you don't like. You know what I mean? Because they know that they're not going anywhere. right? There's this one developer that does essentially the work of 4 developers and does better work than 4 developers, and he knows it, you know. So managing people like that, in my experience, is usually the harder thing, or the hardest thing, I'd say. You know, just keeping everybody, you know, huh? You got one of those, yeah.
Yeah, I got one of them. Second team just lost yesterday, and he's a firecracker.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
knows his stuff.
Stuff, oh yeah.
And I could tell he knows it, and he makes sure he lets you know.
Because he knows that, look, okay, maybe he makes, you know, $180,000 a year, right? But he knows if you fire him, you're gonna have to replace him with 3 people. So now, even if you're paying each of them less, you're probably gonna be paying $500,000.
And in his next role, he know he can go get 250 easily.
Yeah. So people like that, you know, in my experience, are just more difficult to work with.
Yeah.
You know, so.
So it's always a human element.
Yeah,
right?
that's the most difficult thing. I think structuring your software environment, you know, the SDLC process, all of that stuff. I think that's, once you know it, you know it. That's easier. It's just the people part. That's more difficult in my experience.
Yeah, and that's what I try to encourage them. I'm like, you know, the technical stuff, you can learn it, but there's so many people that are working in technical roles that can't like flip that switch and start working with the people or working with the people very well.
Well, you know one thing I've learned though, the more you know your stuff, the more they respect you, and they're willing to defer to you. You know, and the more technical you are, the more the less they're likely to BS you. So this is an aside. Yeah, combative. Because sometimes, you know, so for me now as a software engineer myself, right, if somebody comes to me and tells me, hey, this thing's going to take 2 weeks, there's been times where I would write, you know, a small part of that code, and I say, hey, this took me 30 minutes. What you're doing is just more of this. There's no way it should take you 2 weeks. This is 2 days worth of work. You know what I mean? So the more you're able to, you know, come down to their level in terms of just understanding their, you know, lingo or anything like that, the more likely you're able to just make things work as a team, if that makes sense. You know, because sometimes the conflict comes because, you know, one person is saying this is the amount of work that is required, another person is saying something else, right? And they're just not understanding each other.
Sure.
You know, and you as the Scrum Master, Project Manager, whatever it is, right, you are essentially the interpreter. But if you don't really understand, okay, it's like one person speaks French, one person speaks German. If you don't understand French, but you understand only German, it's kind of hard to be an interpreter, right? So anyway, that's what I found to be the hardest thing.
So you have to make them feel heard, basically.
Yeah.
Like you have to be able to just say, I know where you're coming from, and I know it's not just simple where we can snap our fingers and make it happen, but you know, work with me on making it happen.
Yeah. Well, to some degree, and I'm not saying, hey, you know what, you need to be a programmer. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying, you know, there's some things you can learn, right? Like that won't take that much, even if it's just the lingo to speak. Okay, what's a class, for example, in programming, right? You might never have written one, but at least if you have an idea of what it is, it's easier to communicate with them.
Yeah.
You know, and they're less likely to just BS you. You know.
Yeah. And like we just learned a little bit about GitHub. Like you can learn high level about what GitHub is and what it can do in like a day, right? So at least if you're able to go and talk about things that have to do with GitHub or branching or code repository, they're like, oh, they know a little bit about what it takes to do my job, as opposed to they're like, what did you do today? What did you do yesterday? What are the impediments, right? If that's the only language you have to communicate with them, it's going to make it a little bit more difficult. That's why I always encourage any of my Scrum Masters who join the software development team, one, understand the product that your team is working on first, right? Even if you don't understand it from a technical perspective, like how they do this or how the environments are set up, understand the product and be able to explain it and speak about it in layman's terms, right? Number two, after you understand the product, then you want to start learning a little bit about the technical piece, right? What languages are they using? How many environments are there, right? What does their SDLC look like? When is their release schedule, right? Let's start, and the more you start to understand, the more you'll want to understand, and before you know it, you'll be a Scrum Master that, you know, might know how to code a couple lines of Python or Java or something. And so again, the more technical you can be, or the more technical knowledge you can have, not like you said, you don't have to be an engineer or a coder, but the more you know about it, again, the more they'll respect you, the easier to make your job, and the less they'll like fight you at every single turn because you don't know nothing. Right? I can just tell you whatever I want to, right? So always have a thirst for learning more. Go ahead, Cecil.
I'd like to know how you handle that developer you were talking about, that is that proverbial rock star that might try to talk to you or address you in any manner. Not how do you handle it, but how do you address that? Because it seems to me he could potentially disrupt the entire
Oh, of course.
team.
Oh, yeah. So what I've learned, and this one is just general management, what I've learned is, praise people in public, criticize in private, right? So if I feel like things are going to get really, really tense, there's sometimes where you have to do it in public.
You have to make an example.
You have to make an example sometimes. Sometimes you have to do that, right? But you don't want a combative atmosphere as a rule of thumb, right? It might just be, hey, you know what? Let's talk one-on-one.
Offline.
Yeah. Exactly, right? So you want to take some of those kind of conversations one-on-one, where it's like, okay, you go into an office, hey, what's your problem? Let's talk. Do you have an issue with me? Let's try to make this work. Just regular.
Always just hear people out, I think, because I think that scenario where there's always a strength person, and there's some dysfunction you walk into, so you just, do your one-on-one and meet them and kind of figure out their personality first, so that then there's a connection, so they're not going, every time kind
Right.
of cover your throat when you're in meetings and when you're trying to develop the team. And when they feel heard, that you're going to be working on their situation, their problem where they're having to carry everything. I think that helps a lot.
Yeah.
Because I've had that happen where one person's doing all the work, and then you're like looking at the other three people like, what are y'all doing?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're never going to have a situation where everybody's doing the same amount of work. It's just never going to happen. You're always going to have somebody that does a little bit more.
I mean, look at sports, right?
Yeah,
Pick your
exactly.
team. Lakers, Cowboys.
Somebody's doing the heavy lifting.
Kansas City Chiefs, right? Look at any championship team. Golden State Warriors. There's somebody who's doing like 60% of the work.
Yep.
Right? Whether it's Jordan, whether it's LeBron, whether it's Steph Curry, whether it's Pat Mahomes, right? Whoever that person is. And then, right, and that'll be on some days, but then sometimes it can flip, right? If LeBron is out, everybody's got
And let me add this: you don't want to piss off LeBron as the
Don't want
coach.
to piss off LeBron. Don't piss off.
You're
don't piss off
you're probably
Tom
going to
Brady.
lose your job because you have those kind of developers that really, the people even high up know that they're very important. So if you made it too combative and they had to choose, it's an easy choice.
Yeah.
It's not even a choice.
Yeah.
But I think also what Vic always tells us is that when you first start with a team, like you don't automatically come in trying to change everything. You need to observe, see what they're doing. And I think like Aston had an issue with her developer where he got pissed off and hung up on her. And
Oh my God.
he hung up on her. He was also very disrespectful during daily stand-up. But I think that her mistake was she came in and she day one was like, this is what we need to do. And so when he even stated to her, you're just trying to change everything. You aren't even trying to listen. You're not even trying to understand. And so I think that if you come in and on day one you're like, we're doing X, Y, Z,
You don't have an issue
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You got to pull them out.
with anybody.
Right, but see, my thing is not from day one. Day one, I'm just stating in general. You just mentioned this developer's making 180K, knowing he can go elsewhere and make 250. He's the rock star. You're not trying to wrangle him in, but granted, you are trying to address him to keep us all on a proverbial alignment in the same direction, trying to achieve the same thing. But you got some rock stars that are going to just want to stay on top, and it's going to be done their way or no.
There's sometimes where a rock star has to go. You pay for it in the short term, but long term is better. Personally, I prefer teams like the Detroit Pistons with. I'm sorry, I'm using sports. let me know if I'm doing too much of that. Huh? The Cowboys.
The '90s Cowboys, right?
You know.
We had Evan Smith, we had Troy Aikman, we had Dion.
So it's a more balanced team.
Right?
Like
Balanced, a lot of talent.
that's the kind of team that I prefer to manage, because then nobody tries to, exert their power. You know what I mean? But sometimes you can't have that. Sometimes what you have is what you have, and you just have to work with it. But I found that with those kind of people, if you recognize them, and even just asking, hey, can I speak with you alone, is enough recognition most of the time.
Exactly. That's what I said. Just let them feel heard.
Yeah.
Figure out, and hear what they have to say offline too.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, you stand up, they're not going.
And sometimes they have legitimate reasons, because, everybody else is not doing their work, or they're doing half of their work, and they are really grinding. So it's like, I'm the one doing most of the work, I'm grinding, and you're trying to make my life difficult. Who are you?
Yeah. One of the scenarios I found myself in was I had a very difficult person in any of our group sessions. So daily stand-up, refinement, retro, difficult to the point of like cussing other developers out, right? One-on-one, when I'm meeting with her, because I make it a point when I engage with a team, I want to meet with everybody one-on-one, because one thing I found is like people present differently in a group than they do when you're talking one-on-one. One-on-one, tears, crying in the meeting to me because of what you said. Like, I'm doing all the work, I'm stressed out on the weekends, I'm taking the weekend calls, and these folks are just working 9 to 5 and don't even care if it's creating more work for me on the weekend, right? So there was a certain level of one, recognition that she, wanted and validation, but two, like, I'm also coaching her on like, those are valid issues, but the way you're presenting them in the daily stand-up or the outbursts you're having as a result of them aren't gonna help resolve the issue that you're having. So I'll work with you as long as you aren't disruptive in our group sessions. I'll work with you to try to find a resolution, right? And so now they feel like they've got an advocate with you, even if they are that rock star. They don't have to go out and fight every battle by themselves, right? I'm gonna be not necessarily on your side, but I'm at least gonna bring your issues to the table so we can talk about them as a team and try to find a resolution as a team. Because you just cussing that other developer out, like, I don't think he said he was gonna pick up more stories for you as a result of you cussing them out, right? You're still where you started, right? So again, meeting them where they're at, speaking with them one-on-one, and then trying to help them resolve their issues, especially before you start trying to change things up on the team as a new person.
Yeah, and I think it's not something unique to software companies, to be honest. I think it's really any kind of business, that you go in. There's usually a culture, and if you're coming in as a new person, you're considered the, well, you're considered, without using a negative term, but you're considered the new person, and you really want to go in there and assess what holds culture-wise before making changes.
Yeah, for sure.
So anyway, other questions?
For your company, what does your software development life cycle look like?
Oh, we don't have a set SDLC process, to be honest.
Okay.
And you're going to find companies like that. And it's not like, oh, I don't know, the different processes, waterfall, agile, whatever the case may be. I guess it's agile-like, But the things that we're a small enough team that we get things done, right? But as we grow, then processes are going to, need to be added. By the time you have I don't know, maybe 5, 7 developers, you're probably going to have to formalize a lot of things. So a lot of things we do are not, at least for my company right now, are not all the way formal. So like we've executed testing without a test plan. I know, in an ideal situation you should have a test plan, but we've talked about it, and it's not like a ton of people. Does that make sense? So it just really depends. So I have contractors that work with me also. So it's at 2 or 3 depending on what needs to be done, if that makes sense. So,
Because you like it flexible,
yeah.
how are you, or you must be, I guess, but I'm gonna still ask, how are you mentally with having to adjust to a more structured setting when you mentioned a while ago that you like that flexibility and you don't, bigger corporate, as you get bigger, they have to get more rigid. Are you okay with that?
I mean, me personally, I'm fine with either one. I could work in actually, you know what? A more rigid structure works for my kind of personality because I'm a creature of habit. You know, but I also look at, you know, even process, tools, processes, software, whatever it is, they're just tools. The ultimate goal is to turn $1 into $2. That's really the goal of any company, right? Whether it's Scrum, whether it's Waterfall, I just look at them as tools. So if we're getting things done, I don't get lost in the, you know, the how, right? But I also do realize that as companies get bigger, you're going to have to formalize a whole bunch of things, you know. So, and during that process, you're going to have some people that can't get with the program, you know. And that's what happens. Sometimes, you know, people have to go because they just can't grow with the company, you know. So, personally, I'm fine with either one. I've worked in companies that have very little formal structure, and I've worked with companies that are very rigid, like an AT&T or a Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Extremely rigid and formal. You know, A is A and B is B. You know, this is our document, and we follow everything to a T. You know, so yeah.
And where do you see your company, like what's your, I don't know, this may be kind of a vague question, but what's your end goal for the company as far, I guess as far as size first? You know how some people like to just stay in a certain area and not get too big, or,
Oh, I love that question. Well,
you know, that's why I'm like, just trying to see like.
oh, we want to be as big as possible. I mean, our goal, if everything works out, you know, there are a lot of gates that we have to knock, right, or go through, is to support donations globally. So if that happens, you know, if that happens, we'll be a very large company, you know. So, but you know, the journey for startups is it's more than just doing the right process. It's, you know, having the right partnerships, you know, getting into some doors and the right people want to do business with you. You know, somebody at CNN tweeting the link to your company. There are a lot of things you can't control, to be honest. Okay, like for example, there's somebody I know, you know, and I'm not going to mention his name. He's a person of color. He's black, right? And he went to this accelerator called Techstars. I don't know if you know it. So an accelerator really is for early stage companies that need a little bit of push. So when you go through the very top accelerators, it's almost like a ultimate cosign. So the big venture capitalist companies at that point are more willing to say, you know what, we're going to put $10 million in this company, right? As opposed to you're just some random person somewhere that says, I have this great thing, and they're like, yeah, right. You know, they don't care. He had to do, as a company, he had to get a lot more done. When he got in there were some non-people of color that were there, right, with an idea. They didn't even have a company.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. So,
You don't even get funding
yeah, they'll get funding on an idea.
as a random person.
You know, so that's why I said, like, so with, you know, people of color, there's a lot more challenges and scrutiny, right? You know, to get where you want to go, but it's doable. I know, I won't be doing it. You know, so I don't know if I answered the question. All right.
Any other questions? All right, let's give Kolapo a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming out. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
One last question. I'm going to put you on the spot again. When your organization, and I don't know, you guys may be ready potentially for a Scrum Master now, but maybe due to budgetary constraints, you may not be able to get one. We've got a bunch of students that have never actually worked as a Scrum Master, but have the training and would love an opportunity to intern or volunteer for a period of time to help kind of bring some of that organization to the processes that you have in your company. So if you're open to that, I'd love
Oh,
to
yeah.
introduce you to some people.
Yeah, I mean, once we're ready, hey, why not? Why not? Hey, you know, I mean, I have had, because I know, you know, with training, sometimes you know, myself and Vic were talking about it. Sometimes it's hard to make that transition from, you know, I know the theory, but I haven't actually used it. So, you know, my core expertise is quality assurance because when I graduated from college, that was the first part. Even though I did, you know, software engineering, you know, I'm a computer engineer by, you know, trade. That was the specialty that I jumped right in, right? And QA, yeah, QA, right? You know, I have had somebody that another person, a friend of mine who does trainings. He does QA trainings, and you know, he mentioned that he needed some hands-on, and you know, went through that whole process with him. I even taught him how to code, so that was actually fun. So I understand. You know, making that transition sometimes can be hard. But I know the most confident people, the more confident you are, and it depends on how good you are at BSing. You know, the better you are at that, the easier.
Most of them people that have the position, they don't know nothing.
You get it
No.
right, you be like, hey, you get the job.
But they're confident, they're very confident probably.
Yeah, you be like, what?
Confidence of a mediocre somebody, I won't
That's
say
what
what.
I mean.
Yep,
You don't know this.
yep. It's true.
All right,
All right.
Joe, we're gonna take a break. We're gonna do an activity and